bloated, ridiculously, morbidly obese government. It's great to have a small government conversation. And we turn to Rob Sampson, State Senator Rob Sampson, for that frequently from Wolcott. Rob, let's start off talking about COVID. There is this tug of war going on constantly regarding COVID. The government wants to take more power. They say they want to do it to keep us safe, and people go along with this argument. People fall for it, you could say. Isn't it natural for government to want to keep the citizenry safe?
Well, my reaction is that you're right. It is perfectly normal for government to want to take care of people. And that's the problem. The problem is that if you grow government and you let it do what it wants, it's going to take over more and more of your individual freedom and choices in your life. And the whole coronavirus experience is a perfect example of what the government will do if you let it. Think back, Todd, to the beginning of the pandemic when President Trump and Vice President Pence came to the podium to tell the American people about the impending pandemic. And of course, you could tell they were scared. They did not know how deadly this virus was. They were afraid millions of Americans might die from it. Mm-hmm. And what did they do? They didn't start with a lockdown. They did not tell people they had to wear masks or that they must be vaccinated. They didn't do any of those things. What they did is they asked the American people. They said, we need your help. And they did that because they recognized that American citizens are free citizens, and the choice, their personal health choices, were up to them and them alone. So they asked for 2 weeks to flatten the curve, which is quite flat at this point. But that's what they were looking for. And in fact, they weren't not even looking for 2 weeks to flatten the curve for the purpose of preventing deaths or the spread of the virus, other than to slow it down enough to prevent the hospitals from being overwhelmed.
Yes, they wanted emergency rooms to be able to function without their staff starting to go under from too many people being out sick and then having people piling up in the hallways waiting to get a bed. And that was the big argument. You're right. It was, we need a couple of weeks to flatten the curve. And here we are 17 or 18 months later, the governor just having requested a 6-month extension. This is the permanent extraction of power from temporary crises is a governmental norm.
You're absolutely correct about that. And look where we are today. I mean, the curve is flat. Maybe it took 18 months and not 2 weeks, but the curve is flat. Certainly in Connecticut, there are around 150 people hospitalized with coronavirus in all of the state of Connecticut, and the death rate is less than 1 per day. The last weekly report, and of course they report it weekly now, Todd, because there's not enough information.
Because it's not an emergency anymore.
That's right. And it's not an emergency. So last Thursday, there were 3 coronavirus deaths. I don't know the details, but I suspect these were extremely elderly and possibly compromised individuals already. And I feel for them, and I don't want to see anyone as a victim of the coronavirus, but it is certainly no longer an emergency. And it's certainly
no, but that's also an important point in terms of what strategies would be. We've discussed before the idea that most of the death in Connecticut came from nursing home deaths and elderly people, and that had the defense, the government defense has been focused on how do we keep this narrow band. It's a large group of people, but it's a narrow band in terms of age and demographics and lifestyle. How do we keep them safe? And while everybody else goes about keeping our society functioning and keeping the economy going, we would have been so much better off as a state. And now you're talking about a much tinier group of people where the susceptibility has to do with comorbidities, pre-existing conditions, that is probably causing breakthrough cases and causing the deaths of that do occur, as rare as they may be.
Right. And you're absolutely correct. If the government had been operating in a way that was truly devoted to preventing the spread of the virus and the resulting deaths, things would have been a lot different. The focus would have been on targeting people that are truly susceptible to the virus and protecting them and allowing the rest of society to operate. The whole notion of protecting children from coronavirus, to me, is absurd. Children do not get sick or die from the coronavirus, except in unbelievably small numbers. And I think there's 300 in the entire country. And I don't know
total.
Yeah, total in the entire United States of America, a country with 350 million people or whatever. That's less than 1 in a million. Isn't that right? I mean, it's simple math. The odds are that's just not going to happen. So the idea of putting masks on kids is ridiculous. The way to stop a virus from spreading is for there to be herd immunity in your society. And if you wanted to get that, why wouldn't you let it go to the schools? Let the healthy young people who are not susceptible get the virus and build up the immunity percentages for our entire culture. But they're not doing that. To this day, they are trying to, what I consider child abuse, putting a diaper on a child's face and sending them to school. I talk to teachers, Todd, and they tell me about how these masks get swapped between the kids. They get dropped on the floor. Then they get picked up off the dirty floor and put on. They're hanging below. They're not doing anything. Whether masks work on any level is a debatable subject. But when you put them on children, especially young children, the answer is obvious that this is just some sort of political motivation and nothing to do with public health.
We're talking to State Senator Rob Sampson. Why do you say a political motivation? Why is it not possible that the people who are advocating for these policies that don't make sense are caught up in a kind of panic that's a central government disseminated? So you've got a CDC, and already that creates a problem. The CDC is worried about the politics of the virus. How do we manage the virus in a way that we survive politically? And then then that same attitude then trickles down the chain of command. The White House is doing the same thing. The governors in each state are doing the same thing. The public health departments in each state are doing the same thing. It's all forced into a political realm. And then in order to make sure you don't make a mistake politically, they all do what the CDC says. So it doesn't matter how mistaken the CDC may be. We've got the effect of a strong arm government in terms of the dissemination of a singular policy across the nation.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point I was trying to make. I wasn't saying necessarily that any individual school district or even the governor of the state of Connecticut, for example, is the purveyor of the false information. But I think that they are just as guilty because it takes very little objective thought. And if you're in the role of governor of Connecticut, for example, or you're a member of your school board or in a position of authority, your duty, your responsibility is first to your constituents. And most importantly, it is to the truth. And it only takes a few seconds to go to the State Department of Public Health website and see that cases might be on the rise, but hospitalizations and deaths are not. And that's what matters. I mean, who cares how many people have the coronavirus if people are not dying from it? It might as well be reporting the common cold or pimples.
I mean, most people aren't ill. It's really important to drive that point home. Most people who are in that list of cases have a technical case. That is, they've tested positive. Maybe they've got sniffles. Maybe they've got a sore throat. Maybe they have mild flu symptoms. That's the vast majority. And, yes. And that gets lost on purpose, I think, because they talk about cases.
Right. And why are they talking about cases is the question. I mean, the people that are putting this information out at the top, at the CDC, at the State Department of Public Health, the governor obviously knows what the truth is behind these numbers. How come they're not telling us that there's only 150 people hospitalized in a state of 3.5 million people?
Well,
why
the
are they
governor
not
did
telling
say about
us?
a month ago that hospitalizations are what he looks at. So he did give us a little window into that. Yes, he understands what the truth is, and he follows it just like we do. Rob Sampson is our guest state senator. Let's take a quick break and then continue the in ways that make sense. These are the best political conversations where you're starting from the same point, and that is the American system of government requires that the power be in the hands of the people. And it requires of the government that the government protect us from the power of government. And that part of things seems to have been lost. But Rob, the more this goes on, the more I look to the founders and say, oh my God, the brilliance of what they devised, the clarity of their insight into what the problem was quite amazing.
You couldn't be more correct, Todd. They recognized that government itself was the greatest evil to be avoided. And that almost any one of our problems that we face as a society can be tracked back to too much government. I mean, it's like, why is this sweeping, edict about masks again?
Yeah.
Yeah, which, of course, is what you would do if there was a real emergency. If there's a real emergency, you don't leave it up to the individual towns to say, well, you guys can decide. We could get into the details about the law, because I don't believe the governor ever had the power to mandate masks anyway. But he's got a lot more power when it comes to public health crises than individual town governments do. They don't have the power at all. And his latest executive order essentially just says, well, I'm going to let you guys make your own decision, and I'm going to look the other way. That's no way to lead. And what you're doing is you're putting all of these town governments in a terrible predicament where they have to make a choice between doing the overly safe decision of mandating masks and simultaneously crushing their own community and businesses, because automatically their citizens are going to go begin frequenting other towns that do not have mask mandates.
Well, this is, I kind of like that aspect of it. I mean, separate from the point you're making about the towns not having any right. Structurally, I think that's the immediacy of suffering the consequences of both decisions that you should be facing when you're in a decision-making position, rather than being in some high office where you can see voters not as individuals suffering consequences, but as blocks of voters who you need to get lined up behind you in order to win elections over massive numbers of people.
I completely agree, which is why I believe that individuals should make their choice and not towns.
Yes.
The problem is that these town governments, they're just as weak as the state government is, and they're going to do the same thing. They're going to lean on the CDC, and they're going to say, oh, our town's moving into the yellow. We better do something. And, who's going to suffer but the guy who owns the restaurant on Main Street or whatever business. And the people that live there are going to make choices that are going to ultimately negatively impact that community. And the facts say there is no emergency in Connecticut right now. There is no emergency. Anyone listening, they should go to, online as quickly as possible and look up the COVID hospitalizations and deaths in Connecticut. If you just type in coronavirus portal Connecticut, you get the CDC graph as the first thing you see on the screen. And it just shows a flat line at 0 for deaths for the last 3 or 4 weeks. That's not to say that, something couldn't happen in the future, but we can react to that if it does.
In a spontaneous
Today, there's
way,
no reason.
We've already proven the ability to do. The governor, by the way, obviously agrees. He's on vacation for several days. He's turned power over to the Senate president, Martin Looney of New Haven, not a top of mind person for the average citizen of Connecticut to imagine that's who the acting governor is, but the lieutenant governor also on vacation. The governor gone, I think it's his 5th trip up to his family's 100-acre island estate in Maine this summer. Clearly, the idea of extending the state of emergency was a little bizarre and just wrongheaded. But you wanted to talk about masks, I think, and what should happen with schools. Is there something else you wanted to say about that?
Well, I want to repeat that children of the entire population are the least susceptible to suffer ill effects from the coronavirus, and there should be no masks in schools. And I'm encouraging people listening to do the research, the objective looking at things like I have, and realize for yourself that is completely unnecessary. It doesn't get us anywhere. It's bad policy. It's terrible for children. And go out and support your local community movement that is trying to keep the masks out of schools. I've been working with activists in several towns across Connecticut and trying to encourage them. And we're having some success. And I hope there's a lot more once people start to know the truth about things. That's not to say, Todd, that there are not important emergencies going on in Connecticut. The crime wave is the emergency that the governor should be back in Connecticut addressing today. We should be in special session, passing laws and fixing bad policies that have led to the incredible rise in car thefts and violence and murders that are happening in our major cities.
Can you tell us about those changes to laws that are you suggesting this was created by specific changes in the law in Connecticut? And if so, what do you make of the defense from the Democrats that, oh, this is not us, this is happening all around the country?
It's absolutely them. They have blood on their hands. They created this problem. It is not happening all across the country. It began under Governor Malloy. His first act was to get rid of the death penalty. I wouldn't say that was a huge factor here, but a factor. But then the next step was to let violent felons out of prison early under the risk reduction credit program, which has led to a number of deaths. You have Senator Suzio on pretty regularly. He can tell you all about that. He's an expert. And he tracked the people that were being released and the crimes that they committed. The next thing that happened was they raised the age for which people are treated as juveniles from 16 to 18. And that's exactly the problem we're facing now is we're having more and more car thefts because these, 17 and 18-year-olds are now treated as juveniles and they can get away with a lot more. And then they passed legislation that prohibited police chases, consent searches. And then, of course, they've been undermining the police across the country and in Connecticut with the police accountability bill. All of these things add up to what we have today, which is criminals that are emboldened, especially juvenile criminals, police that are concerned about risking their lives to do a job that's not appreciated. And we're going to have more and more violence. And it's going to continue to get worse as the criminal element in our state discovers that they can get away with more and more. That we've got to put a nail in this coffin right now. We have to stop it before it gets out of hand. I've been working with some of my colleagues in House Republicans. Actually, Representative Craig Fishbein is holding a press conference today at the state capitol. I would have been there with him, but I had some other activities to attend to. But he's going to be unveiling their wish list of things. I don't know if it'll be enough. I think we need to reverse all of the bad policies I just mentioned if we want to have a shot at reclaiming law and order in our state.
And Democrats are when Matt Ritter, the Speaker of the House, spoke on this, I don't know, maybe 3 weeks ago, he said, well, maybe we can surgically tweak, but we certainly don't need any grand changes to the laws as they are. What is that all about? Why would they not be eager to come in and deal with this?
Well, and these are the same folks that passed these laws, Todd. So, of course, they're not going to admit that their decision-making has led to these problems, although I think it's clear as day. It's as simple as a math problem. 2 + 2 = 4. You start to let criminals out. You start to change the way we use law enforcement, and you have a result, which is more crime. And that's where we are. His opinions don't matter to me. What matters to me is the thought and reason that leads me to the conclusion that we need to reverse those policies because they have led to the problem.
All right. State Senator Rob Sampson, rational guy. You hear his political philosophy. Rob, thank you for taking the time to do this. We'll talk to you again next week.
It's always my pleasure, Todd. Keep the faith.
That's Rob Sampson. That's Rob Sampson. That's Rob Sampson. That's Rob Sampson. That's Rob